Good morning, Facebook land. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to this moment, wherever you are sitting or standing, walking or lying down. Wherever you happen to be on this wide and wild planet, welcome. Welcome to this moment. Welcome to wherever you are. Welcome into my space. Welcome, welcome. Specifically, welcome to those of you who I see joining. I'm happy to have you, happy to see you. As always, the invitation is to engage as much as feels good to you. I love your questions. I love your comments. I love your shares. I love the way that your engagement makes this real life versus abstract sort of talking head content. So please feel free to join in the conversation, such as it is. Welcome, welcome. So I've been thinking about this this piece around the stories that we tell, really like the stories we tell ourselves. I mean, it does have to do with the stories that we tell other people, but ultimately we're kind of always telling ourselves. But we do, and we kind of enroll, we bring other people into our world by the stories that we tell. And today, especially, I'm specifically talking about like the stories we tell about ourselves, the stories we tell about our lives, the stories we tell about how it has gone, how it is going, how we believe it will go. And it's somewhat, I believe, so I think most people would say that the problem is that we don't tell empowering enough stories. And I believe that what's more true is that we believe we can only tell one story. And that the truth of like our power, the truth of our liberation, the truth of our wholeness lives in our capacity to tell more than one story about ourselves, about our lives, about any given moment. We know, I mean, if we really look at it, I believe, I know, you know, we all know that actually any moment, any experience, not just if there's another person, right? There's at least two perspectives. But even if I'm just having an experience all my own, that moment, that experience is so multifaceted. It's so layered. It has so many pieces to it that there are, let's just say lots. I mean, I don't know if it's infinite, but it's a lot. There's so many different ways that I could look at that moment, that I could experience that moment, that I could, the lens through which I could see that moment or that experience. So many different ways that I could receive it and experience it. And then so many ways that I could share it back as a story that I tell about, oh, this happened to me. This is happening to me. This is what I believe will happen to me. So, I think there's more conversation around this idea of like, how do we tell more empowering stories? And I think that's great. I think that's a great conversation, is like, how do we shift the frame and tell more empowering stories about ourselves, about our lives? But I think that's still caught in like a limited framework that says we only get to choose one story. And really, I think like we get to choose them all. And that's where our power comes from. So I was thinking about, well, let me back up for a second. In some ways, this is where my like I am a woman who movement was born from. And it took this same kind of route where it first started from like, oh, what's the more empowering story I can tell about? Like, rather than asking like, who am I? Who am I to do this? It was like, oh, I know who I am, right? There's the more empowering story. And ultimately it evolved in this process. And some of you were actually there. I see your names, but at one of the women's retreats that I lead, with Sacred Sovereignty maybe almost a year ago. And we did an exercise. I think we had about 25 women in the room, and every woman, including me, stood up and had a minute. I can't remember now, actually, if it was a minute or 2 minutes, but basically to fill in the sentence, I am a woman who. And the context was around this idea that it is absolutely imperative that we embrace, and by that I just mean hold in our space, that we say yes to the places of pain in our life, the trauma that many, many women, and certainly humans also, have experienced. We say, I'm a woman who, this was my experience in my life or of my childhood, or this was this struggle that I went through. I am a woman who, and our success, our power, our grace, and I'm a woman who this. And women stood up and shared, all the way from like, I'm a woman who, had to call the police on my father, to I am a woman who, makes $100,000 a year. I am a woman who's raised 2 children single-handedly. I am a woman who, and it's just the range that there's really this willingness. And that happened to be at my women's retreat. But I would say this is as humans. As humans, it's imperative that we are able to stand up and say, I am a human who, and fully be like, I'm a human who, and name the truth of the painful, challenging, harder things that we have experienced in our lives, or that we are experiencing in our lives. It might be, I'm a human who's in the middle of heartbreak. I'm a human who's still grieving. I'm a human who's lost both their parents. I'm a human who, that we really be able to hold and embrace that with love, and not say like, oh, so that's my story. It's important that I own my story, so that's my story. It's like, that's your story. And, I'm a human who, I'm trying to come up with these things, like just sitting here on the spot. I didn't plan this, but, I'm a woman I'm a human, who's overcome this, or who's achieved this, or who's so proud of this, or I'm a human who, and to really name also the truth of our beauty and our achievement and our power and our grace, and to say all of these are not separate. These exist within the same human. And everything mundane, I'm a human who's bored about this, or I'm a human, like the willingness to actually claim the fullness of who we are as men, as women, as humans, and say, this is the story of my life. This is the story. It includes all of this. And so rather than, I'm going to claim a more empowering frame or a more empowering story, and also rather than like, well, I need to tell the authentic story of my life, it's like, can I own, can I hold, can I see and express and tell the true whole story of who I am? And that they don't, neither one negates the other. And I believe that's where we truly become like infinitely powerful. That's where, we become just sort of, we're like victorious owners of our life, because no part of it is separate from us. We are not separate from any part, and no part is separate from us. And, I think this can come down to like the tiniest little things of, it wasn't so tiny, I guess it was a huge pain in the ass, but there's 2 pieces I was thinking about around this trip to Brazil that I've been planning with my family. And without going into like a huge story about it, but there was an issue. We're going to Brazil with my father's daughter, who's from Brazil. So he has Brazilian citizenship. My daughter has Brazilian citizenship. My visa was accepted quite easily. And then my son, who has a different father, his visa was rejected. And it was rejected, there was like this huge, I guess it was only rejected once, but there was this huge process. Like I did all the things, I uploaded all the documents, I got new photos taken, I found all the documents, I put them all in, and they were like, we're sorry, you need this. And I'm like, okay, great, here's this. And then they'd be like, well, that's great, but what about this? I'd be like, but I already gave you that, here it is again. I mean, I could show you my email folder with like the Brazilian consulate. It's just epic. Like the number of times I gave them the same documents and the number of times I gave them new documents and all these things. And it was like, so I can tell this is a true story. Every piece of this is true. It's enormous pain in the butt. And it was so frustrating. And I was sending emails, sort of, I was like, I don't want to, I don't mean to be frustrated and this probably isn't your fault, but are you guys talking to each other? Because I attached that to the last email and then I attached the new thing you asked to this email and then you asked for that other thing again. Like, do you not see where this is connected? And it was very frustrating. And it ultimately had to do with that my son's father changed his name. And it's a complex sort of series of things where he was born with one name, was adopted by his stepfather, and so ended up with a different last name than his birth name. And then ultimately, if any of you don't know, when he and I got married, he took his last name as his first name and took my last name as his last name. This is how he became Decker Kunov, for those of you who know who he is. So it was like this, and maybe this is true in many parts of the world, but apparently in Brazil, like changing your name is just, they're just like, who are you crazy Americans? Why do you do this thing? And the only time anyone would ever change their name is like a woman changing just her last name when she gets married, and that's it. And so the fact that so it was like being able to show the series of steps that led to this. So anyway, and I'm like, if you just look at it, you can tell that this is true. And he signed all the documents that says I can take our son to Brazil. Like to me, any sane human being would look at this and go, I can understand how this happens, even if I think it's crazy. And yes, you can take your son to Brazil. So I could tell that story. And then the other story, I realized as I sat with it, and just, spoiler alert, my son's visa was accepted this last time. So anyway, just in case any of you are like on the edge of your seat, like, and then what happened? But I realized the other piece of the story that I could tell is that it is a miracle that I have the documents that I have about all of this. And that is like I could tell this literal magical story about how I went to apply for a visa for my son, and without knowing, like, just naive, I just naive, being like, and then and then being like, oh shit, I need this and I need this. And like, I went to my ex-husband's house, and he lives in two places. And the fact that like everything I needed was in one folder in the house that's like next door to my house. So I did not need to ask him to go find it. He was not in some storage box, like some random place we wouldn't even know. He didn't go like, I don't know. I mean, the number of miracles that occurred in this story is equal to, if not greater than, the number of obstacles. And I mean, I found original birth certificate. I found name change documents. I found a passport from when he was like 4 that shows his original name. I found a passport from when he was like 25 that shows the middle. But it was like a miracle. It was just a miracle that I had all these things. And I realized again in this, it's like I can tell either story. And the point isn't that I can tell either. The point is that I can tell both to myself, like, oh, this happened in my life, that I had this very challenging experience. And in the exact same moments, not like a different, it's like I was also having this magical experience, this of like total synchronicity and miracle that he even still has these documents. This is a man who lost our child's birth certificate in the backseat of a taxi, so like the fact that these documents even exist, let alone all in one file folder, let alone in the house next door to my house, like that's amazing. And then yesterday when we were down in San Francisco to go to the consulate, it was like the tiniest little moment where I just saw how this could be true. Was like I was going to the bathroom and I was wearing these pants with these like tiny little pockets. I don't know why they do that. And I went to pull my pants and my car key came out and landed in the toilet. And And anyway, like I got it out. And then when we went to the car, like my car key still worked. And I thought like both these stories are true. It's true that I dropped my car key in the in the toilet, and it's also true that my key still worked. And this, like, they're both true. And one, it could be like some horror story I tell about my life, how I had to take my key out of the toilet, and the other could be like some miracle story I had where I'm like, oh my god, I dropped my key in the toilet and my car still worked, and like I didn't even need to call Geico or whatever. And I think moment to moment, this is true. And that where we get into trouble is thinking we can only tell one. So it's like the first layer is where we get into trouble, is that we only tell like the kind of what's been done to us and how hard it is, and it never works out, and nobody ever loves us, and we're always left, and so it's useful. It's useful to have the capacity to tell a more empowering story, like, oh, this is the more empowering frame around that. But I believe it's most useful when we can tell both simultaneously, and we allow our true wholeness to be, it's like it becomes, it's almost like it becomes realized as we are capable of holding all of that. And in our willingness to hold the wideness of it, it's also a recognition that we are big enough, we are wide enough, we actually are vast enough to hold the multitude of that. We don't have to choose the painful story or the empowering story. We get both, and everything in between. We get all of it. And then it's like, it's not even like, well, which story are you going to choose? It's like, no, I get all of it. I get to say, how hard it was to be raised by a single mother in the middle of the woods with no money. And I get to say that that's like a fucking miracle and probably saved my life, absolutely made me the woman I am today. And I wouldn't have it any other way. At the same time, I would totally have it a different way. And I would absolutely wish that, I didn't have to wear that ugly purple sweatsuit and like be embarrassed about not having an indoor toilet. Like all of that can exist within the same story, within the same human, like the human that lived back then, 30 some odd years ago, and it can all exist in the human that lives today. So that's what I want to say about that. I'm going to close out here in just a minute. And again, totally welcome any questions, comments, shares you have in just the last little bit. But like, once again, I really want to say that while I believe, and I believe this is often like a useful first, there's kind of two sides of the first step. Oftentimes people actually really do need to claim like the grit, like the gritty part of their lives. There's a place where people often need to reclaim, like, yeah, holy shit, like I actually did go through that. And there's an empowerment in reclaiming, like, yeah, that this thing that we've pretended in my family or in my life that sort of like didn't happen, that I was ashamed of. So there's something about bringing that into the light and reclaiming that can drive out shame. And then there's this other, they're like parallel first steps almost, And there's this other thing, which is like really claiming the empowering story and going, oh, I don't have to tell the sad story forever and pretend like that's my life and live into it. But I believe like truly, like where the real power comes from is our wholeness, which is that they're, and I keep saying both, but the fact is it's more than just one story. It's probably more than just two. It's probably more than three. In any moment or any experience of our lives, there's probably, 3, 5, 10, in some cases, it is infinite. And rather than just abstractly like, oh, there's infinite ways I could tell this, is going like, oh, this is what is true about this. And this is also what is true about this. And neither one negates the other. Those are both fully, truly lived experiences of my life. And I can hold them together because I am wide enough. I am wide enough to hold all of that. Oh, Varian, you and I are like, we're like on some sort of mind meld right now around this. She said, I just told 2 different people this in the last 2 days, that they can coexist. Yeah, I feel like you and I, like, we have our own ways of talking, but we're sort of like on some parallel track lately. And I love it. Amy said, oh yes, I had to claim some shit that I thought made other people very uncomfortable, but I had to share it several times with someone, with anyone, just to make it real and move forward to a more complete whole story. Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, the last piece that I'll say, I guess, because this is, I kind of don't want to end on this note because it's a little heavy, but it feels important, is that I was working with a woman, and there was a group experience that happened. And in that group experience, she had and this is present day, you know, this is in the last year, right? She had the experience that she tried to say stop and people didn't hear her. And it linked back to her to, you know, several different times in her life that have been, you know, all the way from the uncomfortable to the deeply traumatic, where she tried to say stop or no or be heard, and she was either not seen, not heard, or not listened to and honored, you know. And it was like it happened again. And I mean, for her in particular, it's like everybody's on their own path, but I've been working with this woman now for 3-4 years, so I know her. So I was able to say, it is real, like, it is absolutely true that that just happened. Like, you just told us a true story, but it's imperative for you to also recognize that what also just happened was that you said stop and no one heard you, and then you said stop a second time, or maybe it was the third something. You did something and then everyone heard you and everything stopped. And you need to tell that story also. And it's not, again, about covering up and being like, oh, tell a whole new empowering story, like that these awful things didn't happen in my life or that I didn't have this experience. But to be whole human beings, to actually have the power. And when I say to heal ourselves, I don't mean to like heal so that, you know, we have scars, but they can be beautiful, or we have bumps, and we have, you know, like the way that our bones and muscles and bodies are shaped. They're shaped by our lived experience, physical and emotional. Those are still there. And it does no one any good to try to go like, but now I have a new, better, more empowering story that, like, now I say stop and everyone does. We just have to tell them both. We have to tell them both. And then transformation can truly occur. So I'm going to Zoom. Happy to be here with you today. Love you very much. Ciao.